Unit 17 to base, we've got ourselves a code 420 unauthorized wedding underway. The dispatcher repeated the phrase over the radio and I could hear her struggling to stifle a laugh. I set my fork down halfway through a bite of wedding cake and stared at the small radio clipped to my belt because even on my wedding day, 20 years in law enforcement had left me unable to take it off. "Who's behind this call?" I asked, already sure of the answer before dispatch confirmed it. The complaint came from Patricia Henderson, president of the Riverside Estates HOA. She claimed our ceremony violated a laundry list of community rules from unapproved flower displays to exceeding the maximum number of permitted guests. I glanced at Sarah, my bride frozen mid-vow, her hand raised in shock, her lips parted. Then at our 75 guests, nearly half in uniform, and the retired judge who was presiding over the marriage. Patricia Henderson had actually dialed 911 on me, the police chief of Maplewood Township, right in the middle of my own wedding vows. My name is Thomas Mitchell, and for 15 years I've been running this department. Law was my first love until I met Sarah 2 years ago at a local fundraiser. She was the one who insisted a quiet wedding by the lake on my property would be perfect, nothing extravagant, just string lights, handmade touches, and our closest friends and family. My land sits outside Riverside Estates HOA, something I had confirmed with the county office 3 separate times before planning, but Patricia thought differently in her mind. Anything visible from her territory required her personal stamp of approval. She's the kind of woman who measures lawns with a ruler and mails violation slips if a mailbox shade is slightly off from the official pallet. She once even threatened a fine because a neighbor's garden had attracted more butterflies than she deemed suitable, ruining the so-called uniform neighborhood appearance. The battle actually started a week earlier when she spotted rental trucks dropping off chairs for our event. By that same evening, a certified letter landed in my mailbox. It declared that any gathering with more than 10 attendees demanded the filing of Form C-17B 45 days in advance, plus a $500 processing fee. I replied politely, explaining that my property wasn't governed by their association rules. Apparently that answer lit the fuse Patricia unleashed. What I can only describe as a crusade of red tape. She phoned my niece Jennifer, who was arranging our flowers, and accused her of being part of a conspiracy of unauthorized botanical planning. Yes, those were her exact words. Then she tried to stop the portable restroom delivery by planting herself in front of the truck and shouting that temporary facilities required environmental clearance. Reports the driver simply eased around her while she ranted about rogue sanitation practices. Finally, she even targeted the bakery, sending them a bogus cease and desist over what she called an architecturally unsuitable wedding cake that could allegedly be seen from HOA grounds. On the morning of our wedding, Patricia set up what looked like a full-scale surveillance base on the small ridge that overlooked my land. She carried binoculars, a long lens camera, 3 separate clipboards, and even a sound meter. Every time a guest chuckled too loudly, she scribbled notes like a court stenographer. When the musicians began to play, she shouted that we were already breaking the acceptable noise level for a Saturday, but when she actually dialed 911 in the middle of the vows, it was a new record, even for Patricia. 2 of my fellow officers walked toward the arch, doing their best to keep a straight face, while Patricia followed behind them, like she was leading a parade. She had her phone up, recording, narrating each detail as though she were filing evidence for a national investigation. This man, she bellowed loud enough to cut off the judge, is hosting an unapproved event that breaks community codes. There is unauthorized music, disruptive laughter, and the table linens are blatantly beige when the regulations clearly state that fabric must be ivory, eggshell, or sage. The officers exchanged looks with me, with Patricia, and with the crowd now pulling out their own phones. Chief Davidson muttered, just barely keeping from laughing. Dispatch called this a code 420, but this feels more like a Karen 911. Patricia then shoved a cease and desist paper in my hand on HOA letterhead with shiny borders and at least 7 different fake official stamps. "Mr. Mitchell," she said with the kind of outrage you would expect for an actual criminal, "you are ordered to stop this outlaw celebration at once. The Riverside Estates HOA has counted multiple violations, including but not limited to illegal happiness, non-standard joy, and excessive use of baby's breath in decorations." "Patricia," I told her calmly, while my bride in her gown stood watching this chaos, "this is my land. I do not live in our HOA. I have never been part of your HOA. This property has belonged to my family for 60 years, long before Riverside Estates existed." She flicked her hand like it was meaningless, irrelevant. She declared, "Your event is visible from our community. Therefore, it falls under our visual control, and we have history. In 2019, we forced a birthday party to shut down 3 blocks away because their balloon display could be seen from the clubhouse." Officer Park had already turned on his body camera, and several guests were uploading clips in real time. My nephew, who works in marketing, was even live streaming the entire fiasco. Patricia, fueled by the attention, kept raising her complaints. She pulled a measuring tape from her pocket and announced that my wedding arch was taller than the allowed size for temporary builds by 7.3 inches, that the petals scattered on the grass counted as litter, and that my Aunt Martha was wearing a hat in violation of Guest Attire Code 12. My bride, still holding her vows, finally spoke with a gentle tone. Her irritation was obvious as she snapped back that we were right in the middle of our wedding ceremony with 75 guests present, including Judge Harrison officiating, 6 members of the city council, the district attorney, and nearly half the local police department, and she demanded to know if Patricia really wanted to keep interrupting a lawful event on private land. Patricia, however, wasn't backing down. She whipped out her phone again and placed another 911 call, insisting that she needed more units because things were escalating, claiming we were refusing to cooperate, and now attempting to intimidate her by surrounding her with so-called authority figures. That was when Judge Harrison finally spoke up in his deep, commanding courtroom tone, addressing her directly as Miss Henderson and reminding her that abusing emergency services was a criminal act. She had reported a wedding on private property where she had no standing while trespassing, disturbing the peace and filing false complaints. Patricia whirled around, furious, denying she was lying and instead pointing at our decorations, yelling about how the flower arrangements were not regulation height and how the Unity candle was lavender-scented, even though she claimed HOA rules only permitted vanilla or unscented candles. Within a single day, video clips of her antics spread everywhere across social media. The headline that the HOA president tried to arrest the police chief at his own wedding became one of the biggest trending stories, and the footage of her obsessively measuring our arch while shouting about violations was instantly turned into memes. Some creative internet users even remixed her complaints into a ridiculous but oddly catchy song. The county attorney who had attended our wedding was not nearly as amused. Patricia hadn't just dialed 911 once, but 3 separate times, each call more exaggerated than the last. By the final call, she was reporting imaginary drunken fights and even livestock running wild, none of which were true, unless you counted our 6-year-old ring bearer who nearly toppled over from spinning around too much during pictures. That was enough for multiple charges to be filed, not only false reporting, but also providing misleading information to dispatchers, causing a public disturbance, trespassing after being told to leave, and even attempting to impersonate law enforcement by telling arriving officers she had the authority to shut everything down. Security cameras had caught her climbing over my fence with a tape measure in hand, which legally counted as breaking and entering. 2 days later, the HOA board was forced to hold an emergency meeting to deal with the chaos, and what they uncovered was worse than anyone expected. Patricia had apparently been funneling HOA funds into her own surveillance projects, including a drone she used to spy on backyards. She had also been sending official-looking cease and desist notices on HOA letterhead without any approval from the rest of the board. Dozens of residents stood up to share stories of Patricia threatening them with fake violations that didn't exist in the bylaws. The room was packed, and voices rose demanding that she be removed immediately. Someone shouted that she had embarrassed their entire neighborhood on a national scale, making Riverside the butt of online jokes. Patricia defiantly claimed she was only fighting to protect property values and aesthetic standards, but another resident shouted back that their home prices had already dropped 10% since her videos went viral. Several weeks after the chaos, Patricia finally stood before the court to answer for the charges she had brought upon herself. She had managed to secure an attorney who tried to paint her actions as nothing more than an overly passionate attempt at fulfilling her HOA role, but the judge, who happened to be the very same one who had officiated my wedding, was not swayed. He firmly explained that Patricia had no power outside the boundaries of the HOA, and that dialing 911 to report imaginary crimes was not dedication but criminal misuse. The prosecution then rolled the tapes of her frantic calls. In one, she claimed there were over 200 guests at our wedding, creating what she described as a riot, while in truth only 75 friends and family had attended. In another, she insisted we were running an illegal event space and selling alcohol without a license, when in fact nothing was being sold, and the champagne had been poured only for a toast. Her final accusation was perhaps the most ridiculous of all, alleging we had exotic animals roaming the property. The so-called exotic creature turned out to be my sister's therapy dog, a gentle golden retriever named Max. Patricia then attempted to bolster her claims by hauling out a massive binder crammed with so-called evidence. She displayed photographs with obsessive measurements scribbled across them, a PowerPoint presentation warning of the dangers of unregulated parties, and even paint samples to argue that our tablecloths were the wrong shade. She grew so carried away she tried setting up an easel for a full presentation until the judge ordered her to stop when she took the witness stand. Her situation worsened. She freely admitted to stepping onto my land without permission, claiming it was for documentation. She even acknowledged she knew I was the police chief and declared that made my alleged offenses far worse for a public official. When pressed on why she had not simply ignored the matter, she said that aesthetic violations were still crimes in her book. The ruling came 2 weeks later. Patricia was found guilty of multiple offenses, including 3 counts of abusing emergency services, trespassing, disturbing the peace, and filing false reports. Her sentence was heavy. She was ordered to complete 200 hours of community service, specifically helping with setting up and tearing down community event equipment, fined $5,000, placed on probation for 12 months, and prohibited from dialing 911 unless a real emergency arose. Any misuse would mean immediate jail time. The HOA board had already voted her out and issued a formal apology to Sarah and me, making it clear that the association had no authority over properties beyond its borders. When this was announced, Patricia erupted at the meeting, warning that everyone would regret removing her, as property values would collapse without her strict watch. As the judge delivered the sentence, her face flushed through shades of red until it settled into a deep purple. Clearly not among HOA-approved colors. Sputtering at the punishment, she shouted about protecting property values and upholding standards, insisting someone had to guard against the chaos of unregulated gatherings. The judge calmly replied that she might have thought twice before turning emergency services into a weapon for her personal crusade against mismatched tablecloths.